HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Mr. Wilder and Me by Jonathan Coe, read by Kristen Atherton.
London. One winter's morning, 7 years ago, I found myself on an escalator. It was one of the escalators that takes you up to street level from the Piccadilly line platforms at Green Park Station. If you've ever used those escalators, you will remember how long they are. It takes about a minute to ride from the bottom to the top, and for a naturally impatient woman like me, a minute standing still is too long. Even though I was not in any particular hurry that morning, I soon began walking up the escalator, easing my way past the line of stationary passengers on the right-hand side, thinking to myself all the while, I may be almost 60, but I've still got it. I'm still fit. Until, about 3/4 of the way up, I found myself stuck. A young mother was standing on the right-hand side, and on the left, holding her hand, was her daughter, a girl of maybe 7 or 8. She had blonde hair and was wearing a red plastic mac with a hood that made her look a bit like the little girl who drowns at the beginning of Don't Look Now. Everything makes me think of a film. I can't help it. There wasn't room to push past her, and, in any case, I didn't want to rupture this lovely moment of connection between a mother and her child. So I waited until they reached the top of the escalator, and then I watched as the little girl prepared herself to jump off. Even from behind, I could sense her anticipation. The way her eyes must have been fixing themselves on the moving track ahead of her with concentrated energy. The coiled readiness in her tiny limbs and muscles. And then, when the moment arrived, the sudden, fierce movement as she leapt forward and landed safely on terra firma, following which, no doubt relieved and elated by the manoeuvre, she performed 2 little skips, still clasping her mother's hand and pulling her slightly forward in the process. And I think it must have been these skips, more than anything else, that made my heart flip, that made me catch my breath, that made me watch in wonder and longing as the mother and her daughter headed off towards the ticket barrier together. It made me think at once of my own daughters, Francesca and Ariane. Children no longer, and how for them, when they were 7 or 8 years old, the mere act of walking was sometimes not enough. It must have felt simply too ordinary, too boring to express the intensity of their delight in motion, in the joyous novelty of their relation to the physical world, which meant that sometimes they too would randomly break into a skip or a hop, and in the process they would carry me forwards with them, each of them clasping one of my hands, and sometimes I would skip too, to keep up with them, and to show them that I was also capable of sharing their joy in the world, that middle age had not yet drained it out of me. All of these thoughts flashed through my mind as I watched the mother and her daughter proceed to the ticket barrier, and they all swelled and distilled themselves into a sudden, transitory, but overwhelming sense of loss and longing, which flattened me and took my breath away, and obliged me to rest for a moment, stepping aside from the relentless flow of passengers, catching my breath and resting my hand upon my breastbone, until I too was ready to rejoin that flow, to press on with life, to put my card on the card reader and pass through the barrier, and then head upwards towards Piccadilly and the thin, late morning light. I walked along Piccadilly very slowly, reflecting on what I had just seen, and the way it had made me feel. Tomorrow, Ariane, the elder of my twins, by 45 minutes, would be leaving home at last, flying to the other side of the world. It would be my job to drive her to Heathrow, to wave goodbye at the entrance to departures, while pretending to feel nothing more ambiguous than pleasure at the wonderful opportunities waiting for her in Sydney. And then, my husband and I would be left only with Fran. With the problem of Fran. With Fran, who in the last few weeks, suddenly and dramatically, had gone from being a child to being a problem. A problem which had flawed us both, and would no doubt continue to do so for the foreseeable future, until we could find a path which led through the mess she had created and out the other side. But there was no sign of that path appearing yet. The task I'd set myself in coming to Piccadilly was soon accomplished. I went into Fortnum's to buy Ariane a going-away present, and it didn't take long to find what I wanted. Tea. She loved tea. For her it was the taste of home, and I had always loved making it for her. I bought her a pack of 6 different blends, which came complete with its own silver teapot and strainer, and I tried to picture her in some featureless student room in Sydney, pouring tea from this pot into her Union Jack mug, and sipping it, and being transported back to our kitchen at home, her elbows resting on the old pine table, and her hair sheened with low sunlight, cutting through the branches of the apple tree in the winter garden outside. Maybe it would comfort her. Or maybe, perhaps more likely and even better, she would not need comforting. The year was 2013, and it was the first week of January, that disorientating time when the Christmas festivities are over, but the world has not yet quite returned to normal. Feeling the need to do something that would seem routine, quotidian, I decided to go for a coffee in the bar at BAFTA. Perhaps there would be somebody there that I knew. It would do me no harm to have a chat, an exchange of gossip and pleasantries. The bar was almost empty. It still had that air of post-Christmas desolation. There was only one person that I recognised, sitting by himself at a table for 2 by the picture windows, overlooking the street. Mark Arrowsmith. Not the first man I would have picked for a friendly catch-up. But beggars, as they say, cannot be choosers. Mark it was. I went over to his table and waited for him to look up from his MacBook.
"Calista!" he said. "Darling, what a nice surprise."
May I?
"Of course."
He closed the lid of the computer and moved some papers out of the way to make room for the cappuccino I had already bought myself at the bar.
"Sorry about all this junk," he said. "I finally got a meeting with Film 4 next week. They've asked to see a budget, which I assume means they might be serious at last."
He arranged the last bundle of papers into a stack and put them away in a plastic folder. Mark must have been in his late 60s by then. Although nothing like as athletic, he had something of the look of Burt Lancaster in Local Hero. As I said, everything and everyone reminds me of a film. He had the eyes of a dreamer, or used to about 10 years before, but these days they were clouded with defeat. Mark had been trying to get the same film made for the last 25 years or more. Sometime in the late 1980s, he had taken out an option on a novel by Kingsley Amis, a name which, back in those days, still carried a certain cachet. It had seemed quite a realistic proposition, and he had secured the services of a well-known director and 3 or 4 bankable actors. But, for some reason, the final tranche of money had fallen through at the last minute, and then the director had become unavailable, and then 2 of the actors had become unavailable, and one of the others had begun not to look so bankable anymore, and before he knew what was happening, the project had a bad smell hanging around it, which everyone started to notice except for Mark himself. As a producer, he already had a couple of reasonably successful credits to his name, a feature film and a one-off drama for BBC Two. But since then, he had made nothing, and the quest to get this stupid Kingsley Amis adaptation off the ground had come to obsess him. He had become one of the fixtures at BAFTA, always sitting by himself at a table for 2 with his MacBook, waiting to have a meeting with someone who might, or might not, have read the 15th draft of the script, and who might know someone who knew someone who worked for a hedge fund, which might have some money lying around at the end of the tax year, and who might have nothing better to do with it than invest it in the screen version of a minor novel by someone nobody ever talked about anymore, and who is now so out of fashion that you might as well try to get an adaptation of the Yellow Pages onto the screen. But still, Mark refused to give up, and in the meantime, his moustache had turned white, and a film of rheumy disappointment had begun to cloud his eyes. The odd thing was that he also kept a house in the south of France, and had 2 children by his second marriage in private schools, and nobody knew where his money came from. But I'd often observed this state of affairs among the British, and assumed that he came from a family who had plenty of money going back generations, and were skilled at keeping it to themselves. It stopped me from feeling too sorry for him, anyway. And the other thing that stopped me from feeling too sorry for him was the awareness that I hadn't done a serious piece of work for about 10 years either, so I wasn't exactly one to talk.
Have you been working much?
Mark asked now, speaking with a directness I could have done without.
Not really,
I admitted.
Did you see...
I mentioned a British film which had enjoyed modest theatrical success a few months earlier.
I did,
said Mark.
Was that you? I thought it was...
He named a young British composer of film and library music with a growing reputation.
Some of it was him. I was just the orchestrator, in theory.
You remember the little figure on marimba, which played whenever you saw them driving in the car? I sang the simple melody for him.
Of course,
said Mark.
That's what made it. That's what everybody remembers.
That was me.
And yet, he got the Oscar nomination.
Mark shook his head, dismayed as always by the way of the world.
You're so talented, Cal. Will you do the music for my film? Say you will. It has to be you.
Of course, I said yes, but I did not take the offer seriously. It was as if Mark was offering to pay off my mortgage for me when he won the lottery. Never mind. It was a nice gesture, and he meant it. And it wasn't his fault that he was sure to spend what little remained of his working life in pursuit of this doomed project.
I've got Dame Judy interested, you know,
he said, as if he could read my thoughts, and wanted to reassure me that he was not some deluded madman.
I thought she was already attached,
I said, casting my mind back to a conversation we seemed to have had on this very subject decades ago.
She was attached, and then she wasn't attached, and now she's attached again, he explained. Only now she's going to play the grandmother, not the mother.
That figures, I thought. The cast for this film remained pretty much the same in Mark's head. They just kept moving up a generation. If it ever got made, the one-time hot young leading man would end up playing Grandpa as he pushed himself around the set in a wheelchair.
Also,
I said, a tad too defensively, not wanting him to think that I was sitting at home twiddling my thumbs and waiting for the phone to ring, even though I was.
I'm writing some music of my own. Concert music?
He asked.
Kind of. It's film-related, but not actually for a film. It's a little suite for chamber orchestra. I'm calling it Billy.
And then, I added, in response to his interrogative look,
as in Wilder. What a nice idea! I didn't know you were a fan.
I adore his films. Doesn't everybody?
Of course. It's incredible, really, when you look back. Just one masterpiece after another. I mean, how do you manage to do that in this industry? Double Indemnity? Masterpiece. Sunset Boulevard? Masterpiece. He just kept turning them out. Some Like It Hot, The Apartment.
What about after that? I asked. Mark frowned.
I don't know. Did he make many films after that?
Of course he did. About 10 of them. Struggling to recall,
He said, "Was there one about Sherlock Holmes?" "Did you ever see Fedora?" I asked. Mark shook his head. "I don't think so. If I have, I've forgotten it." "Well, I haven't," I said, because I was there when he shot it. His eyes widened. "Really?" Frowning again, he mumbled, "Fedora. Fedora. What was it about?" And I'm afraid I couldn't resist saying, "It was about lots of things. But I suppose you could say that mainly it was about an aging film producer, trying to make a film which was completely out of step with the times." That seemed to close the conversation. Shortly afterwards, Mark gathered up his things and left. From the window, I could see him crossing Piccadilly and heading north towards Regent Street. The sky was darkening, and it was starting to rain. I am a contrary person. I would be the first to admit that. Our last dinner together as a family of 4 was perfectly cheerful and pleasant. But that was exactly what depressed me about it. There will be no more of those for a long time, I thought to myself afterwards, as I loaded the dishwasher. The girls had gone upstairs to their bedrooms to do whatever it was they did up there. I decided to watch a film, for distraction. We were at the start of the awards season, and as BAFTA voters, Jeffrey and I had about 30 DVD screeners to get through. We started watching an American action movie with a cacophonous soundtrack in which the noise of explosions, gunfire, and car crashes competed with a thunderous orchestral score. After about 10 minutes, he was fast asleep on the sofa, his snores loud enough to drown out even the noise of the movie. I watched it to the end without the least sense of interest or involvement. Everything about it was formulaic to the last degree, and I marveled at the time, energy, and expense that must have gone into something that would be forgotten in a few months' time, and forgotten by the audience the minute they left the cinema. I followed it up with a British comedy about 2 feisty old dears who went on a road trip to the south of France and got involved in all sorts of scrapes. It was meant to be quirky and life-enhancing, but it filled me with a deep sense of existential despair. Every time something amusing was about to happen, the composer nudged us in the ribs by having the strings play pizzicato. Back in the 1950s and 60s, it would have been a bassoon that did the nudging. After 30 minutes of these 2 lovable pensioners larking about in Provence, I wanted to kill them both. I turned off the TV and went back into the kitchen, gloomier than ever. In circumstances this desperate, there is only one thing that can console me. I always keep at least 3 different kinds of brie in the kitchen for emergency situations. Other people drink to forget. I eat brie. At the moment, my fridge contained a good Coulommiers, not strictly a brie, but close enough, as well as a superior but mass-produced supermarket brand. But this was no time for compromise. Only a top-notch Prix de Meaux Fermier would do tonight. Of course, it should have been standing at room temperature for a couple of hours, but there was no time for that now. I spooned a good dollop out of the box and plastered it onto a water biscuit. The release of those delicate, nutty, mushroomy flavors onto my tongue was exquisite. The texture was firm but creamy. Bliss. I scraped out some more, and then some more, and before I knew what I was doing, I'd eaten about half of it in 10 minutes flat. "Oh dear," said Geoffrey. He had woken up and was standing watching me from the kitchen doorway. "Bad as that, is it?" "You will never understand," I said with my mouth half full. "The consolations of a good brie. You're a cheese Philistine." Geoffrey liked cheddar and red Leicester at a pinch. He really didn't have a clue when it came to cheese. He sat down opposite me and poured himself a half-tumbler of Lefroy. "Everything will be all right," he said. I spread cheese onto a new cracker and devoured it in 2 mouthfuls. "How will it be all right?" I asked. "It just will. Life goes on." I thought about this answer and found it wanting. "So our daughters have grown up," he continued. "That's wonderful, isn't it? They've turned into beautiful young women." "It's not just that," I countered, petulant. "Why? What else is it?" "Did you notice the music in those 2 films?" "Not really." "No, you did the sensible thing and fell asleep." "Well, what about it?" "That wasn't music, it was just noise, written by numbers. Not a single melody, not a single new idea. And that's what people want these days. They don't want what I write. For God's sake, no one's commissioned a score off me for 15 years. The industry's not what it was. Everybody knows that. Anyway, now you have time to do other things." "Other things? Such as?" "I thought you were going to write some new music. Your Billy Wilder thing." This was true, of course, but it wasn't enough. "What's to become of me, Jeff?" I said, clutching both of his hands. "I have 2 talents, 2 things that give me a reason to go on living. I'm a good composer, and I'm a good mother. Writing music and bringing up children. That's what I do. And now I'm basically being told that neither of these skills is required anymore. On both fronts, I'm finished. Kaput. And I'm only 57. 57, that's all." I reached out for his whiskey glass and took a swig. Big mistake. Whiskey and brie don't go together. Not at all. "What's to become of me?" I repeated. The next morning was the one I had really been dreading. The post came freakishly early, while Geoffrey and I were having breakfast. Ariane was upstairs finishing off her packing. Fran was in the shower. When she came down to the kitchen, she was in a hurry. She had a temporary job at Cafe Nero, and her shift started in half an hour. There was a letter for her with the NHS logo in the corner of the envelope. She opened it and said, "January the 14th. A week on Monday." She meant that this was the day the procedure had been scheduled, to terminate her pregnancy. She handed me the letter, and I read it, but couldn't think of anything to say. Geoffrey said, "Well, that's good, I suppose. The sooner it's over with, the better." I stood up and walked towards Fran, meaning to give her a hug, but she saw me coming and managed to duck out of the way. "I'm late," she said, taking a bite out of a piece of toast and downing her espresso in one. "I'll see you later." "Did you say goodbye to your sister?" "Oh, I forgot," she said, and ran back upstairs. "She's not going to see her again for months," I said to Geoffrey. "How could she forget?" "Teenagers are weird," he answered. She was upstairs for a minute or 2, and then she came down and put on her coat and made for the front door, apparently quite unperturbed by the prospect of prolonged separation from her twin. "So, you're okay with this, are you?" I said as she stood in the half-open doorway. "The appointment, I mean." "Sure." "And you definitely want to go through with—" "Not now, Mum, okay? I'm late. This isn't the time to talk about it." "It never seems to be that—" But Fran was already on her way down the path to the main road. I looked after her, helplessly,
and then went back inside. Geoffrey was munching on a piece of toast and reading The Guardian.
Am I the only person in this family who feels anything? I asked. One of our daughters is pregnant, and the other one's flying to Australia. Why am I the only one who can't take any of this in their stride?
It's your Mediterranean background, said Geoffrey, an answer which infuriated me.
Athens is not on the Mediterranean, I shouted. And my mother was from London, and my father was half Slovenian, and I'm just as emotionally repressed as any of you.
All he had to offer in response to this was, everybody deals with things in different ways. Another of his maddening and meaningless generalizations.
You can't even be bothered to come to the airport with us, I said unfairly.
It's a teaching day, he said. It's been in the diary for months. I'll go and say goodbye to her now. He went upstairs. Like me, Geoffrey was finding it hard to get real work in the film business these days, and instead spent more and more of his time teaching at the National Film and Television School in Beaconsfield. Of course he would have come to the airport with us if he wasn't teaching today. I knew that. I was just lashing out, in my anger and grief. I think you're allowed to do that kind of thing every so often when you've been married 25 years. I walked over to the French windows which connected the kitchen to the garden. We lived, still do, in a 4-bedroom terrace in Hammersmith. Cheap when we bought it, absurdly overpriced now. That's one thing, incidentally, that I've never quite been able to understand about the British. How eager they are to regard their houses as financial assets rather than family homes. Geoffrey was constantly monitoring the rising value of our house via various property websites. But to me, first and foremost, it was home. And I hoped that our daughters felt the same way. When I looked through the French windows this morning, for instance, what I saw was a map of Ariane's childhood, an atlas of memories. The apple tree that she used to climb, the long, thick branch to which Geoffrey had attached a swing which was still there, still visible behind the out-of-control foliage of the laurel bush, if you looked hard enough. The grassy corner where the girls had loved to picnic in the summer, and where, during one rare snowy winter, they had once tried to build a snowman. The wrought-iron table where Ariane used to sit and draw, her brow furrowed with concentration, her tongue sticking out between her lips. I still had those pictures, folded up in a cardboard box beneath our bed, even though she was desperate for me to throw them out. Did she remember any of these things herself? Or did she no longer care? She would be happy in Sydney. I was pretty sure of that. The conservatorium had offered her a scholarship, and it was a fantastic opportunity, as they say. And Fran going to Oxford in the autumn was another fantastic opportunity. If only she hadn't screwed it up for herself by getting pregnant. Ending the pregnancy was the right thing to do. Probably. She didn't look happy about it. But why would you look happy about something like that? The father, he was just a boy, wanted nothing to do with it, and nothing to do with her. So there was no point looking for support on that front. It made no sense for her to have the baby. And she had been brought up, I hoped, to see sense.
Right, that's done,
Geoffrey said, coming back into the kitchen. He grabbed the house keys from the hook on the wall, kissed me on the cheek, and then he was gone too. Which left just me and Ariane, alone for the last time. Heathrow Terminal 3. A loathsome place if you've come there to say goodbye to someone. Ariane had kept up a happy vein of chatter in the car, gossiping about friends, talking about a new book she was reading, and I couldn't decide if she was genuinely light-hearted or was just doing it to mask her distress.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?